And turn your Bibles this morning to Acts chapter 22. There was an author a long time ago by the name of Charles Dickens. He wrote many books, but one of his books was entitled The Tale of Two Cities. And it starts out like this: it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. Now, these words could well describe the ministry journey of the Apostle Paul as we've been following it in the book of Acts. And it also describes what life brings to any of us while living in this fallen world. Cyclical periods of ups and downs, of the worst of times and the best of times. And since his conversion, the Apostle Paul had experienced a series of situations that could be characterized exactly like that, the best of times and worst of times. He had become an apostle of Jesus Christ to the Gentile world and have been establishing churches all over Europe and Asia Minor and various places to the point to where there was a church in almost every city. And Bill was telling me that eventually some of those cities, over half the population were followers of Christ. And so what a great work he has been doing, and it was the best of times. But during that time, he had also been persecuted severely, and he had been stoned and beaten and imprisoned. That was the worst of times for him. Now, back in chapter 21, we saw how Paul had arrived in Jerusalem after many years and was welcomed warmly by the pastor elders and by the overseers of the church there in Jerusalem. And they rejoiced with him in his testimony of how the Gentiles throughout the world were receiving Christ. And what a blessed thing it was to hear all of that. They were excited about what was going on. It was the best of times for Paul and those Jerusalem elders. And so we saw that Paul was told of tens of thousands of new Jewish converts that he didn't know about. There were myriads of them, tens of thousands of them. A myriad is 10,000. And so rejoicing in all of these new converts there that he was hearing about, not just the Gentiles, but now these new Jewish converts as well. And it was the best of times. But then he was told that these new converts, many of them had a false report about him, that he had abandoned his Jewish roots and that he was encouraging all other Jewish believers to do the same. And that was a false report, and it was the worst of times. The Jerusalem elders wanted to prove to these new Jewish believers who thought that Paul had abandoned his Jewish roots and was inviting other Jews to do the same, that it was not so, that was a false report about him. And so there was this scheme for him to go along with 4 other Jewish Christians to the temple and to publicly make a declaration of their Nazirite vows of gratitude and surrender to God. It was the best of times as they made this plan for Paul to do that. It's the first time he had been in the Jerusalem temple in a long time. He was excited about it. It had been prophesied by Agabus the prophet that Paul would be arrested and placed in chains while in Jerusalem. And that is exactly what happened to him. A riot broke out when certain Jews recognized him and falsely accused him of bringing Gentiles into the area of the temple that was for Jews only. And if you were a Gentile in that area, you were imperiled for your life. They could take your life from you. And so an angry mob tried to take hold of Paul to kill him when the accusation was made that he had brought these Gentiles into that area. And it was the worst of times. But a Roman commander named Claudius Lysias, we learned that in Acts chapter 23, was summoned, and he rescued Paul from this murderous mob. He placed him in chains just as the prophecy had said, and the commander knew nothing about Paul but assumed that he was a notorious Egyptian terrorist. And Paul introduced himself in Greek to the commander as a Roman citizen from the highly acclaimed university city of Tarsus. The assumption would be as a Roman citizen. Then he asked for permission to speak to the angry crowd. To them he spoke in Hebrew, and he gave his testimony. You know, on some occasions, the best witness that we have is our personal testimony, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's hostile to our faith. You can tell them, I'm not going to argue with you. I don't want to debate with you, but I want to tell you what Jesus Christ means to me and what he's done in my life. I've done that on several occasions, and it's very effective. The awful experience, though, of being rejected and nearly killed by his own people was the worst of times for Paul. But despite having been placed in chains, Paul was given an opportunity that he had always dreamed about, and that was to proclaim the gospel through his testimony to thousands of his own countrymen. That was the best of times for him. In this, we recognize that is how God works. He works things together for good when they seem so bad. Okay? He works things for a good purpose. This difficult world sometimes pushes and pulls us into the worst of times. But God uses those experiences to accomplish some good purpose. Throughout my life and 45 years of ministry, I have experienced many highs and lows. And what I have discovered is that the worst of times comes to an end, and the best times are what's on the schedule next. By the hand of God. He works behind the scenes to work things together for good. Now, let's transition into chapter 22. Here, we are told about Paul's testimony to this angry mob who had sought to kill him, and God used the Roman commander to make this possible. An interesting sidebar is that while Paul faced so much hostility from his fellow Jews, it was the Roman justice system of all things that provided more opportunities for him to continue his mission. So in a sense, the Romans were on his side for a long time. They wanted to treat him fairly. Actually, the Roman justice system was a very fair system in those days. And they did not want anybody to bend it or break the rules, even if they had political influence and those kinds of things. And so, the Romans were, in a sense, part of his support system. So, opportunity sometimes comes to us from the most unexpected sources. So you can expect God's help to come from unexpected sources. Remember that when you're in trouble. Acts chapter 22, verse 1. Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. And when they had heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. Then he said, I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. So Paul's defense was his testimony, as he essentially said, you don't really know me, so I'm going to let you know me. I'm going to tell you who I am. Let me properly introduce myself to you. It's been more than 25 years since Paul was a member of the Jewish ruling council that put Jesus on trial and commissioned Paul to persecute the Christians. And many in this crowd knew very little about him. 25 years is a long time, So he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, thereby letting these Jews know that he was one of them. He was born in Tarsus, but raised in Jerusalem as a student of the famous Rabbi Gamaliel, who was one of the top 5 rabbis of all time. Everybody knew about Gamaliel. And so Paul used Gamaliel to open the door for these people to listen to what he had to say. He was taught according to the law, just like them, and was zealous toward God just as they were. He said in verse 4, I persecuted this way, that was what the church was called back then, to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. So Paul is telling them that he is, in a certain sense, just like them. And he was a persecutor of the people of the way, just like they are. And that on reflection, as he has thought about this, it was the worst of times for him when he was doing those things. He hated what he used to be as a violent persecutor of the Jesus people. While doing this, he did not realize that it was the worst of times in his life. He was exhilarated by it. He was happy about the opportunity to persecute Christians. That's what kind of got him going, got his juices flowing. A zeal for God, although God wasn't really behind what he was doing. And so he looks back on that now and he sees how awful that was. Did you ever do that? You see the change in your life that Christ does in your life, and you remember the way you used to be and how you were in denial about how awful you used to be and the things